We need to understand that there's no real opposition party in the United States. The Democrats attempt to pose as the opposition party, but there are numerous examples we can point to where they just fail to pose an actual meaningful opposition to the bipartisan establishment's agenda. Progressives within the Democratic Party, like AOC and Bernie Sanders, can look like they're an opposition force as a result of their policy and their rhetoric, but there are numerous occasions where they just fail to use their authority to take the action that's necessary to prevent the bipartisan establishment from doing what they want to do. A recent example of this failure to pose a meaningful opposition can be seen in the Democratic Party's failure to use their authority to stop the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court before Election Day. There are numerous mechanisms that the Democratic Party, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, could have used to delay the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett till after the election. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party failed to do so, largely because party leadership thought allowing Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court before Election Day would motivate the Democratic base to turn out and vote on Election Day and hopefully flip the Senate. But that didn't happen. The Democrats, so far, haven't been able to flip the Supreme Court, pending the Senate races in Georgia. And as a result of that, there's now a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court for the next generation, that if a case comes to them, they can potentially overturn basic human rights for millions of people for a generation. That's as a result of the Democratic Party refusing to use their authority to delay Amy Coney Barrett's nomination. And that's not even including the fact that as a result of the Democratic Party allowing Donald Trump to cement a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court for a generation, that puts almost a permanent roadblock in the way of passing any progressive legislation, even if somehow the left wing of the Democratic Party miraculously takes control of the government. Even if, under those miraculous circumstances, if the left wing of the Democratic Party takes over the government and implements and, through Congress, passes Medicare for All and a UBI and a universal housing guarantee, a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court can say, all of that's unconstitutional. That can't be implemented. So even if, miraculously, Medicare for All gets passed through Congress under a Biden administration, which is a fucking... It's not going to happen. Joe Biden said he would veto Medicare for All while he was president, even if it passed Congress. So Biden would veto it before it even had the chance to get to the Supreme Court. But if it miraculously got to the Supreme Court, a 6-3 conservative majority, no doubt, would say, that's unconstitutional, have a nice day. It's just funny, because they'll never say that for illegal, endless wars waged by the executive branch without any congressional approval. Another example of the Democratic Party just being completely unable to pose a legitimate opposition to the bipartisan establishment can be seen in how how even progressives in the party refused to take a stand against the $4 trillion bailout of corporate America that was included as part of the CARES Act that passed at the end of March. As a result of allowing that $4 trillion bailout to be attached to the one-time $1,200 payment and a temporary unemployment insurance increase that expired at the end of July, as a result of tying that $4 trillion bailout to the CARES Act, another stimulus hasn't been passed since the end of March, leaving hundreds of millions of poor and working-class Americans with no federal assistance, at a time when 50 million Americans have filed for unemployment in the last 8 months, and 12 million Americans have lost their health insurance in the last 8 months. And these people are being left without assistance due to the fact that in the passing of the first stimulus bill, every member of Congress, including even the most progressive politicians, allowed a $4 trillion bailout of corporate America to be included in the same bill as the meager payments to some Americans. Progressives in Congress can talk about how we need to pass another stimulus, and they can put forward proposals for what should be done, and they can say that Republicans aren't doing anything, and that Republicans are refusing to negotiate, and they're not wrong in saying that Republicans are refusing to negotiate, but they're also refusing to acknowledge that they gave up all their leverage towards passing another stimulus bill by allowing the $4 trillion bailout to be included in the first stimulus bill without forcing all those other things that you want to be included, like Medicare for all, a UBI, hazard pay for essential workers, paid leave for essential workers, a rent cancellation. You gave up all your leverage to get all that shit included in the next stimulus when you allowed the $4 trillion bailout of corporate America to be included in the first stimulus. You're not going to get the Republicans and the corporate Democrats to come back to the table and work with you when you gave up all your leverage in the first round of negotiations. So if you look at their rhetoric and their policy, you can say, yeah, occasionally they look like they're an opposition party. The progressives within the Democratic Party look like they're in opposition. But time and again, when it comes down to crunch time and they have to use their authority and the power that they have to make a difference, they cave to the party establishment. And they work with the rest of the Democratic Party to do horrible bipartisan shit with the Republican Party. The reality is that as a result of the fact that the United States has no real opposition party, the only chance the American public has at getting its government to act in their interests isn't through electing friendly politicians that in their rhetoric and their policy will present themselves as if they're on your side. Just time and again, they've shown us that their policy and their rhetoric may sound and look like they're on our side, but when it comes down to crunch time, they'll allow Amy Coney Barrett to get nominated to the Supreme Court. They'll allow the $4 trillion bailout to be included in the CARES Act. So, in order to force the government to act in the interests of the people, regardless of which political party is in power, there has to be large enough social movements outside of the government that are organized to force the government to do the right thing, regardless of which party is in power. And we're starting to see those movements form in the protests that have been going on since the Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd. We've seen those protests expand from just mobilizations against police brutality to organized movements against the bipartisan ruling class. Because people all across the country are starting to see that even in democratic states, the epidemic of the intersections between poverty and racism are apparent everywhere, even in the bluest of states. Due to the fact that there is no real opposition political party in the United States, a mass movement of the people needs to fill that gap, to force the government to do the right thing. We have the ability to end poverty. We have the ability to make sure nobody's homeless, to make sure nobody dies because they can't afford health care, to make sure nobody dies because they can't afford anything. The ruling class, the bipartisan ruling class, just funnels all of the money to fund warfare and bailouts for their corporate donors, and they give the scraps to the people. We have to start demanding that the opposite happen.